So today we're going to talk about inclusive chaplaincy, and in particular my research. It's preliminary results that I want to share with you from my PhD, which is specifically around how non-religious pastoral cares are integrated within traditionally faith-based healthcare chaplaincy teams in the UK. I originally studied in Holland, as you can see from my last name. I really hoped that I was going to get a Scottish last name after I married to a Scot, but unfortunately his father is Dutch. I did not select him to be, so I went from Van Dyke, which was hard enough for people to pronounce, to de Wal. So the joke is I went from a dike to a wall, so it's still a barrier in some way. So today I want to share with you some quotes from reflexive thematic analysis that I've done so far, but also everything that we do in chaplaincy is usually based on storytelling, isn't it? It's about narrating. Maybe listening to one story, or how we actually share together on this conference as well our own stories of who we are and our identity. So I remember when I was a little girl, because my parents were far from normal in that sense, and they don't mind me saying that, where my mother and my dad, they weren't really religious. I was raised in the Netherlands to begin with, a very secularized society. My mom had a shop religion where she had Buddha statues next to Maria statues, believing in karma, dharma, reincarnation, and doing yoga. She's still very flexible, way more flexible than me and my sister. And my dad was is a conspiracy theorist. So I know all of them out there, which was, as you can imagine, quite interesting and always ever evolving. So I had an... Yes, sure. I will dial it down. So it was an interesting upbringing in the sense that my mum and my dad were both quite different in how they actually looked at the world and the world around them. And for me, I never really had religious experiences. I never went to church. So for me, it was finding meaning in the experiences that I had in life and what I valued, thinking philosophically about the world around me. Why do we wake up in the morning? What is important to us? But what also came with interesting parents was that we were vegetarians long before people were vegetarian. So all we had was the Linda McCartney products. Do you remember those?
Yes, yes.
Exactly. And then all of a sudden they disappeared one day and we were back to vegetables and potatoes. But what I remembered as a child is that all of the other children were quite interested with the lunch that I would pack on a daily basis coming into school. Pumpkin bread and vegetarian sausage spread. And they would usually stare at me and gawk in awe, as in, what does she have today? And I can see you're laughing, Andrew, as well. Some recognition there, yes. So me coming in as a non-religious chaplain within a faith-based context was almost re-experiencing being a vegetarian in a meat-eating world. So that's why I want to start by reading out a little story about that. You can read it with me as I read it out. So imagine that you're invited to a dinner party around the 1950s. The wife of the house traditionally cooks a nice pot roast dinner and makes the meat juices sing by enhancing it with herbs and spices and creating it into a nice thick gravy. You arrive there from the year 2022 and then remember that you weren't asked any dietary requirements, but you're sure that they'll understand that you prefer not to eat meat. You're warmly received into the foyer, and before you are sat at the dinner table, you spot the pot roast in the oven from the corner of your eye. You think it's only polite to say that you prefer not to eat meat, as you are a vegetarian, and assure that the dinner sides will suffice for a nice meal. There's a deafening silence. The ladle, which the lady of the house held tightly to scoop the gravy into the serving dish, clatters on the floor, and the echo penetrates the empty bellies, which slowly become filled with disillusionment. You don't eat meat? Says the lady of the house with a shocked look on her face. No, I don't, sorry, you reply, thinking that this wasn't such a big deal, as there are many others that you know who are vegetarian. Slowly the questions start, and you start feeling you must defend why you choose to be vegetarian, rather than follow the mainstream meat eaters, whilst you're still standing in the foyer. The warm, welcome experience of just a few minutes ago seems to have been replaced with a chilled breeze, and you feel you don't fit in. Questions arise in your head whether to stay or go, and hope for some understanding. Maybe if you explain why you are the way you are is enough, and they'll come to terms. but in the end, you're a vegetarian and they are meat eaters. Can we overcome this difference? Do you see the analogy I'm trying to create here? This happened in 2018, these different headlines, and there's only a few that I'm sharing with you today. As I was trained in the Netherlands, it was quite a safe bubble in the sense that it's quite normalized to have people of different faiths, beliefs, and humanist backgrounds. And I had this beautiful university that trained me to become this humanist pastoral care from a non-religious perspective. And I thought, I'll just fly an hour across the North Sea and it will be exactly the same in the UK. But it really wasn't. It was a very different culture. And the reason why is because in Holland, this has been a growing tradition of humanist chaplaincy since, well, after the Second World War, effectively. So it's very embedded, very integrated. But in the UK, it's only been since 2016. So it's only about 8 years that this has been developing. So it's very, very new. So when I came here with my suitcase of, literally one suitcase, because it came by bus to London. Now when I move, it's truckloads of things. I don't know what I've accumulated. But I have my master's degree from a humanist perspective, which was equivalent to, for instance, theology degrees that they would ask for you to be employed as a healthcare chaplain. And still was really hard to find a job at the beginning because it was so new. People did not know how to respond to that request. And then once I finally got a job, which was only 4 hours at the beginning at a hospital in London, which was an entry-level training role, I soon after, a couple of months later, found my first position, which happened to be a head of chaplaincy position in Buckinghamshire. That happened. People were amazed. A non-religious person in chaplaincy who's going to lead priests. And then different headlines emerged about atheists leading priests. Never said I was an atheist, I'm a humanist. And then the podcast started and the radio session started, where on one day I had 15 different interviews, one at a time, all BBC channels. Then I picked up recordings of Australia, where some priests were very angry with me being an antichrist because I should not fit in such a thing that's spiritual and holy. And I was actually seen as the projection of many fears that religion might be marginalized. And in an ever secularizing society, am I actually specifically hired, for instance, in the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, as a ploy to finally oust religion and to secularize all of it. So where I had to start was not by just looking into how to integrate my job, a new job, and to learn the ropes in that. But where I had to start was to say, hello, my name is Lindsay. I come from the Netherlands. I'm just a human being like you. And I happen to be a humanist with non-religious beliefs, rather than all of those projections that might really scare you and you might be frightened of. And that's what I want to emphasize today as well. It's nothing to do with secularizing or ousting religion within healthcare chaplaincy. Actually, humanists stand for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where we want to celebrate the expression of religion and belief. But all we want is a seat at the table and to be able to provide that like-minded care that many of you do too. May that be, for instance, from a Catholic tradition, Baptist, or in the UK, for instance, where we have Muslims or Sikhs or Hindus that look after their communities. The same would be for those that might have non-religious beliefs and who want to speak to somebody with that background. Now, in my reflection group, it was already interesting as well because it came up, why are you called here in the UK non-religious and then pastoral care as well? And I appreciate we come from different cultures and how we call terms and terminology is already wildly different. So for instance, in Holland, I would say geestelijk verzorger is more like spiritual care or counselor. I'm just looking at some Dutch colleagues here in the audience. When I went to the States at the humanist community at Harvard, they preferred humanist chaplaincy. When I came to the UK, they preferred non-religious pastoral care. So you can see already contextually and culturally very different, and we'll see that throughout the presentation too. Why it's called non-religious, something that might look like an oxymoron as well, where it's an opposition or a negative phrasing, is because, again, it's so new. And when we started knocking on doors to say, please, can we have a seat at the table, people said, absolutely, we'll call you when a humanist comes in. And that never happened. And you can imagine a lot of people don't even know what that means. When I come to a bedside and I say I'm a humanist, some people think you're a humorist, like I'm a stand-up comedian. Very tricky in a palliative environment, I would say. So Humanist UK stands for non-religious beliefs in the plurality of that. So may that be atheist, freethinker, agnost, humanist, and then traditions that might combine those as well, humanist agnost, humanist atheist, just to complicate that. But you can see within the Christian kind of tradition, you also have many different ways to relate to that, don't you? So that's why non-religious. Now the pastoral care part is because Humanist UK, my community, my organization that endorses me to be a humanist healthcare chaplain, they did a poll with the UK population to see what was more accessible for people with non-religious beliefs to speak to in times of need. And they felt the word chaplain was a very Christian terminology, and they felt that barrier sometimes, specifically if they might have been traumatized by religious institutions, that they might not feel comfortable and at ease to speak to somebody that was called a chaplain. Pastoral care for them felt more accessible, where it was more the focus on emotional support. Again, terminology is never perfect, and we very much understand that pastoral care has still religious connotations as well, but that's why I want to just set the scene as in why we call it non-religious pastoral care. But for my research, I refer to chaplaincy because that's the common most used term within the UK. Yeah. So, what did I do? So far, I will look at something that I reviewed from the literature as well. What kind of literature is out there around UK-based healthcare chaplaincy, focusing specifically on the non-religious coming into chaplaincy practices. And there's very, very little. There's a lot of publications in Europe. For instance, the University of Humanistic Studies do a lot of research in the Netherlands, as well as, for instance, in Belgium. There's a lot of research there. But there's very little from UK voices about the cultural context of humanists entering these teams. So there's a lot of research still needing to be done. I then looked at reflexive thematic analysis for questionnaires and semi-structured interviews, and there were 108 participants that responded to the questionnaires, faith-based as well as non-religious based. 44 were non-religious, 64 were faith-based. Most of them were actually of a Christian background. It was only one person that was a Buddhist who actually wanted to be referred to as a secular Buddhist, so not faith-based, but a non-religious based. And another one who was a Muslim. So the rest was all of Christian background. Interviews, that was split down the middle, so 42 interviews in total, 21 again with non-religious, and 21 who were faith-based. Nope. There. So with the literature review, and I've jotted down the title as well in case you would like to read that article. It is free access as well, so you can just access it. There's no paywalls or anything. There were 3 specific topics that emerged when looking at the UK culture and backdrop of humanist or non-religious practitioners coming into healthcare chaplaincy. The first is that people recognize that there is a changing landscape within spirituality, and how to address that need. So where people used to belong very much to specific faith and belief frameworks, people are more loose in their spirituality. And I know that's a conflicted term as I look at Simon, because spirituality is a container concept at the moment, but it is what people create themselves about what they believe in. Taking my mom again for an example, Maria statues, Buddha statues together, people mix and mash a lot. And all of us, regardless of our faith and belief, have to respond to this kind of unique view of the person that we're supporting with. Also, there's a lot of people that don't identify specifically with the term religion. Half of the population in the UK declare to be non-religious. Again, there's a lot of terminology in the way that people interpret it, might be very different. And I had colleagues as well that said, well, I am of faith, but I'm not religious. So there's also a lot of stigma, for instance, with the term religion, and what does religion mean? There were specifically worries, as topic 2, about chaplaincy funding. So money, resources are very scarce, very limited, and teams are surviving. They can't really innovate, they can't really develop. There doesn't seem to be a lot of recognition, I would say, either, where there's a proper kind of way of how chaplaincy is located within the healthcare service. It depends from, we call it trust, an accumulation of different hospitals together. So it depends from trust to trust. At my previous trust, I fell, for instance, under nursing. In my current trust, I fall under therapeutics and palliative care. But I've heard of other chaplaincy teams that fall under estates, so cleaning facilities. So it's very random where people are, and that has its complexities of how people will know you, find you, and appreciate your service. Topic 2 is quite interesting because if you're trying to survive, how can you flourish? And I think that's not just UK-based from what I'm hearing over the last couple of days, and I'm seeing some nods there. So how can we actually flourish if we're surviving? And topic 3 was around the challenges where we work in multi-faith and belief teams, and the use of the Christian language in specific can create barriers that exclude the non-religious, but also other minority faiths, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Baha'i, interfaith, and all of the sorts. Now, it is normal that there might be lots of Christian language, because, for instance, in the National Health Service, it all started with Church of England chaplains, and then that expanded to including other Christian chaplains. And then that expanded into multi-faith chaplains, so other faith traditions, still relating to a higher power of God. And then all of a sudden, these weirdos here today also wanted a seat at the table, and we don't refer to God. So that whole identity of, at least, for instance, our service is linked to a higher power or a deity or a God, was derailed in that sense because humanist and non-religious practitioners also came in, looking at the meaning of life, purpose, values, identity, but not linking that to a higher power. And we'll have a workshop in the afternoon more about what that includes, about horizontal transcendence, so won't delve into that now. So how do we actually address that language for people to still understand what our service means within chaplaincy, not dilute it, but make everybody feel welcome and know that the service is literally for everybody, because we cater for a very large population with a variety of worldviews. Now, what I've noticed in my research, there's lots of misconceptions, prejudice, and assumptions on both sides of the coin. So you can imagine, even in the Netherlands as well, when it first emerged after the Second World War, non-religious had to create a position to actually say, we are different than. So the differencing part is where you actually say, we are different than you because A, B, C, D. So you see that push away from religion. And you could see that similar trend as well within the UK, where you can't say how you're different if you don't step away at first to say that you're different in myriad different ways. Now we can see a pullback again in the UK context where we work together really well, but that's still an ongoing development. So there's lots of bridging still needing to be done to understand both sides, and the willingness to be open, to address challenging questions that might be uncomfortable or very normal to yourself, but actually being willing to look at yourself and reflect on that, like we do at these conferences as well. So there's different themes that were identified in the questionnaire, and we'll also look at the semi-structured interviews. So the first one relates to the chaplain's role. So this is faith-based as well as non-religious based. So how people look at what do we do as a role. Partly one as a profession, the second one as working in institutions. We'll look at that one first. So the chaplain's role from both sides, they said it's very much about being professional, having a presence, so being alongside, during vulnerable situations where we respect individual choices, so that it's person-centered. Whatever that person wants to talk about, we're there for them. It's also contextualized a professionalism within specifically collaborative or spiritual existential activities, and a community engagement. So may it be because you belong to a church or a faith community, or may that be when you participate in secular mindfulness. It's that connection with other fellow human beings on your journey. It's very much about promoting inclusivity across all faiths and beliefs, supporting patients, but also families, staff members and visitors that may come into healthcare. And it's beyond just patient care. It's also addressing those existential questions of life, and sometimes where we have to advocate for people who are marginalized or are vulnerable and can't speak up for themselves. So may that be, for instance, where they don't understand their diagnoses, and you say, would you like me to ask the doctor to come and see you? So that kind of advocacy. It's being able to promote faith-based as well as non-religious worldviews, as well as conducting rites, rituals, ceremonies, faith-based or non-religious, and to have that vision of holistic care, bio, psycho, social, and spiritual layers, and to educate other healthcare professions about that. We are experts in the field in actually doing that. And how can they address that with the patients that they see to properly refer to our services? Now, there's a huge variance in how we call ourselves, and in the next 2 slides, you can see how people try to describe what they do, and I think that's where identity starts getting lost. It comes together, though, again, later on in this presentation when we look at the skills. But first, some quotes. So the chaplain's role, I won't read all of them out, and this presentation will be shared with you if you want to read a bit more. But for instance, one person said, being 100% with another person who wants your attention and interaction at a time of discomfort, disease, or disorientation, recognizing their vulnerability and the realities of their lived experience in a way that values and respects their individual choices and interpretations. That happened to be a non-religious participant. A religious participant, in my mental health context, enabling service users to explore the existential questions of who am I and what is the meaning of my life, providing voiceless families and carers with a voice, supporting staff to enable them to be as effective and authentic as they can be in their job role, religious participant. Now, I'll leave that here for now because you've got many more quotes to go through, but you can see how they both address those existential questions of life, regardless of faith and belief, and how we're there 100% for another person in times of vulnerability. Look at this. Which one do you subscribe to? And I can imagine if I were to ask all of you here today, there would be some extra added on that board behind me. So I tried to categorize it a little bit into different ways of how people describe themselves. So for instance, support specific, volunteer, ward visitor, emotional welfare support worker, or faith and belief specific, reverend, or non-religious chaplain, non-religious pastoral care, non-religious pastoral support volunteer, humanist volunteer, humanist carer, humanist pastoral volunteer carer, Muslim chaplain, Muslim spiritual care provider. Then we get more to the pastoral, spiritual, religious specific. Again, a plethora of different ways of how to describe it. And then last but not least, no professional title, just your name. Which is nice and personable, but do people actually know what kind of service you come from? Or are you just a nice bloke down the corridor who asked who you were? So where is our identity in all of this? But you can see the frequencies of how often people mention it. So majority in the UK is still chaplain, as you can imagine, because it's rooted still within that Christian tradition, and people understand that because of the history of it. But there's also more emergence with pastoral care, again, because non-religious as well come in, and they understand that that's a term that people can relate to as well. But language is still problematic. And I won't go in yet to how departments are called, for instance, because that's a wild variation too. Now, some quotes again about working in institutions and how people relate to that specifically as a chaplain's role. So I'll read out the middle one. The team has a duty to awaken other staff members to the fact that spiritual support is everyone's concern, and the team is responsible for training other staff members in how to conduct a spiritual needs assessment. The spiritual and pastoral care team disseminates knowledge and provides support and care when needs are acute. The role also includes the performing of rites and rituals which may offer succor to an individual. Invariably, these are thought of as being the provenance of the religious, but those with other worldviews can develop person-centered rituals which will assist an individual on their spiritual journey. When appropriate and required, the spiritual and pastoral care team will approach religious representatives from the community to visit and support an individual with a specific religious need. Now, at some of these quotes, I can just omit whether they were religious or non-religious participants. It's only when we start looking into assumptions and misconceptions that voices start to vary, but still where people actually feel quite similar in the way that they might not feel understood, but from a different perspective. Now, when we look at what are our unique selling points actually, and we don't always dare to market ourselves well, and I know it's business language when they say USPs, what's your USP? But we have to start thinking in those concepts if we actually want to survive as a service. So if we were to compare chaplaincy to other psychotherapeutic services, what are the similarities, what are the differences, for instance, and what makes us different from other well-being services? So what people thought the common ground was with, for instance, a counselor or a psychotherapist, is the shared emphasis on effective communication, being non-judgmental when we listen, and promoting well-being of the person that we see. Where we collaborate with other well-being services is, for instance, through a platform that is multidisciplinary, where we discuss somebody's well-being in hospital. But where we differ, our unique selling points, is that we're specialized. We are specialized and trained in spiritual care, addressing worldviews, values, beliefs. We're specifically trained for pastoral, spiritual, and religious support. And we provide support that's grounded within our own religious or non-religious perspective. So we come with our own beliefs as well when we support people. We facilitate rituals and ceremonies. We advocate for diverse worldviews in healthcare, and we have a person-centered approach. And these are specifically our unique selling points. It's what was described by both faith-based and non-religious-based chaplains. What was also appreciated is that chaplaincy is seen as non-medical, where, for instance, a psychologist is more seen as medicalized or part of the clinical spectrum, where there's diagnoses happening and we try to assess, have a better outcome for a better future. But actually, chaplaincy is flexible. It dances in the moment. We have to adjust like chameleons in that sense, as was mentioned already within this conference, at a moment's notice. And we have very open-ended engagements. We never know if we're going to see the person again next week, even if we hope or think that they will be there. Or we never know if we're going to have an hour with that person or just 5 minutes because they need to go to a physiotherapy appointment and you're rudely interrupted. So it's the beauty of knowing our unique selling points and where we might differ, especially because when the non-religious start to come on the scene, the question I sometimes had that I was asked was, well, if you're non-religious and you don't relate to faith, why aren't you just a counselor? Because you already look at the Rogerian method, Carl Rogers, who's a psychologist, empathy, unconditional positive regard, for instance, being able to have those congruent conversations. Why are you in chaplaincy? And that's a really good point. Because we look also, firstly and foremost, at the worldview of the person that we support, and that's our first frame of reference. And the second might be the method, how we actually engage with people, questioning, listening, showing empathy and compassion. With psychotherapeutic models, it's usually the other way around. The method comes first. May it be cognitive behavioral therapy, integrative, existential, and maybe second, they'll talk about your worldview. But that's not always a given. Here's some quotes again. Again, I won't read all of them out, but it is only in that moment, non-uniformed, outside of treatment plans and medical procedures, and there is no attempt to confront, interpret, solve, or explain. Uses counseling skills at times, but there is no contract or agenda. No one else in the hospital environment is allowed to practice spiritual health care apart from chaplains. All others are allowed to offer counseling, talking therapies, and pastoral support, and do so. But only chaplains are allowed to pray for people and are trained to talk with patients about their faiths and beliefs, and existential and religious worries and fears. And I think sometimes we sell ourselves short by actually not underlining that we're professionals. We are. We are trained within these specific areas, our unique selling points. Now, what about the experience of multi-belief setting? Because especially in the UK, it's more and more emergent that people of different faiths and belief traditions work together. And how do people actually experience that? Now, common approaches of people who are faith-based and non-religious based is that they both promote active listening, emotional support or pastoral care, exploring beliefs with that person-centered focus again. So there's no deviation with the people that we see that we think we need to assert our own worldview onto them. It's about what they want to talk about. Firstly and foremostly, it's person-centered. And the opportunity of working with colleagues of different beliefs is that it enhances inclusivity, it challenges assumptions, because when you're confronted with somebody else who's different to you, you will have questions and you will have engagements with a person that you can ask the questions to. And we're challenged ourselves where if you are always rooted in your own tradition, you might actually stop being curious about what people actually believe. But when it's wildly different to yours, you have to ask those questions. But it also brings diverse perspectives into team discussions. So how do you actually engage with a patient? Have we thought of cultural implications that might not be our own cultural kind of awareness, but it might be from one of my colleagues in my team? The benefits is that we have an enriched practice, and through support, we can actually be able to see and respond to different worldviews and beliefs. Now, the challenges and differences that were described were that sometimes faith-based chaplains find it difficult in religious care to integrate non-religious practices. One specific example in the UK is, for instance, something that we call on-call services. So, for instance, it's 24/7 service. We respond to out-of-hour calls, and usually it was left specifically for those that were of a particular faith to respond to them. I often also got those remarks by saying, but Lindsay, how do you do that? Can you be on an on-call rota? Because all of our referrals are religious. And when they need somebody to come out and pray or do the sacrament, for instance, which I can't do, nor anybody else but a priest, how do you respond to that? And it's a valid question because it hasn't been done before. But if it won't be challenged, if we don't say to our healthcare professionals, actually chaplaincy is changing. We've got a multi-faith and belief setting now, and did you know that we actually also care for people with non-religious, spiritual and existential needs, and you can call for them too? It will never change. So as example, rooted in practice, at my previous trust, after I was there for several years, the healthcare professionals knew that actually they could also ring for non-religious support. And those on-calls very much were starting to balance out with religious requests and urgent non-religious requests. Not just Joe blogs in bed C wants to have a chat with you at 11 in the evening, but actually he's really facing about his mortality, he has suicidal thoughts, and he just doesn't know what the meaning of life is anymore. And he really needs to talk to somebody because he doesn't know how he's going to get through the night otherwise. Could you come over? So where we might find those difficulties and periods of transition that might be awkward because we don't yet know how we're going to respond to it, we have to embrace that uncertainty like we do on a regular basis when we walk into a room and we don't know what's going to happen when we engage with people. We're trained in uncertainty, so let's do it again. There's also, for instance, where non-religious chaplains often meet skepticism and feel that they're unequally treated. And in particular, because it's so new, that they often come in as a volunteer, because most of the time they don't have equivalent to a theology degree. I was trained in Holland. Now we do have a master's finally in the UK that's for humanist and existential pastoral care, but it's still very costly. It's about £10,000 for just 1 year, and it's 2 years, and there's no job guarantee. So it's quite a commitment, isn't it? And it only targets certain people who might be able to pay for that specific course. So they often have to supplement with other degrees that might be transferable or relatable. But most of the time, they land as a volunteer in a team, and then you already have a hierarchy difference because they might not come in that often. They are seen as just a support help. There's not always specific support in place at every specific trust to actually integrate volunteers in general within the team, so they don't always feel that they have a voice. And as well, they feel that sometimes the training that they receive to be accredited as a non-religious practitioner is very much undervalued. And you'll see some of those quotes as well come by, where, for instance, we in the UK have a training by the Non-Religious Pastor Support Network that looks at the beginning of people wanting to become a humanist chaplain if they already have a degree, for instance, in counseling, philosophy, psychology, etc., that's equivalent to then also be trained up for accreditation as a humanist chaplain. But that's a weekend course. And I'll let that sink in. And I understand that when you compare that to a theology degree, that sounds quite stark. But it shouldn't be compared to a theology degree. It's that society hasn't yet found the model of how to properly replace theology on an equivalent of other transferable skills, where the weekend training course should just be a top-up to recognize that they're safe to practice and they're endorsed or accredited by their faith or belief group. But there's still work to be done as well from the non-religious perspective in the UK by having more robust courses that are affordable. And that's something that we are developing because that is of utmost importance to be able to provide equitable training and care. And some of you were in the CPE training yesterday as well, which was a breakout room, but that is something that I will discuss later on as well as a potential option to actually see how we can all be trained up at equal standards and integrate practices and reflect on our practice regardless of our faith and belief. Now, some really felt that we're supported. They had allies of different worldviews. I too have had that, and it was really important. Otherwise, I would not be here where I am today. People took a chance on me, and some were warned with, if you hire this girl, you're going to get loads of media. And they were like, okay, I'll try it anyway. And it turned out okay, hopefully. But we need to support each other. 5 minutes? I thought till 10. Oh.
If you want questions, okay, 10, but then not a lot of questions.
I will skip to the end. So I will just look at theme 4. The interviews, if you'd like to talk to me about that specifically, has similar outcomes, but I reserve that for now because I'm aware that I want you to still have some questions. But finally, chaplaincy support in practice. When I actually asked them to interact with a case study, where it was very different of how we describe ourselves as practitioners, this is where the overlap actually was. And that's where the assumptions are actually myth-busted, as in how we all work so wildly different, and all faith-based chaplains, all, for instance, pray with people, was the assumption. All non-religious people avoid religion like the plague. It's not right. Actually, all of them were introducing the chaplain role in whatever way that they said it, pastoral care, chaplain, etc., focusing on listening and support without giving unsolicited advice. Often it was initiated by staff referrals or just going onto the ward, seeing if somebody wanted to talk. The consent of the patient was prioritized. Do they actually want to engage? And the skills that were expressed was paraphrasing, summarizing, reflecting back to enhance communication and understanding, offering, again, advocacy where needed, discussing further support where they might need to refer to other well-being services. And interaction topics were very much around emotional exploration, the affirmation of the situation. For instance, that sounds really hard to face that whilst in hospital. To encourage them to say more and to express themselves, but also to discuss their worldviews. And for some, that included God and as well prayer. May it be Christian or Muslim or Sikh, for instance. But it was based on the patient interest. There were inquiries about their identity. Who are you now? Who are you going to be? The occupation, hobbies to get to know more about the person. And then they explored the social side and the communion side. Do they have social networks? And how do they actually connect with fellow human beings? Now, lastly, what I would like to show with you, and I will skip ahead as you can see, is some recommendations. So the challenges are societal expectations, recruitment, but I think primarily the funding and resources that seems to be a real block. And with that, how can we widen the role of chaplaincy? So I'm not saying everything falls on funding and resources, but a lot of it does. Because when you actually look at the hierarchy of needs of Maslow, that we all surely are acquainted with, that first layer of physiological needs, having air to breathe, have a roof over your head, feeling safe, if you don't have that sorted, how can you go to the top of the pyramid where you can have self-actualization or flourishing? And I feel we're stuck in the UK in that first layer where we're surviving and we're not striving. So what I was asking constantly was to have interfaith and belief dialogue, but actually when somebody's in survival mode, it's fight and flight. And the brain is not always lend itself to then talk open and empathically about how can we actually find bridges together. I mean, there's many of people that do, but the profession in the whole is in trouble. It's really in trouble. And that's why I would really promote to be able in the UK to be more professionalized, to have a secure placement within our health service, to go for recognized status, which we don't have yet, under something called allied healthcare professional status, that would then require to have specific training standards, where again we can then have equitable access to training regardless if you're non-religious or faith-based, which we're now running within Sheffield Teaching Hospital with Daniel Nuzum in the back as the clinical supervisor from Ireland, where clinical pastoral education is all about being rooted in your profession, reflecting on your profession, and engaging with people of different worldviews that are your colleagues. Instead of a course here for Muslims, maybe a C course there, theology for Christians, and if you've got £20,000, an MA for non-religious. Do you see what I mean? So we need to be able to actually market, promote, and shout about our service, our unique selling points, be professionally recognized, and don't feel embarrassed that we have to be everything or nothing, but actually embrace that we are quite unique. And then we can start going from surviving to striving and actually integrating that multi-faith and belief approach and interfaith and belief dialogue. So I reserve that for now. Thank you all for listening.